On January 24, 1848, a man named James Marshall was inspecting a sawmill he was building along the American River in California when something caught his eye. Glittering in the shallow water were small metallic flakes. He picked one up, examined it, and his heart began to race. Gold. He had found gold. Within a year, this single discovery would trigger the largest mass migration in American history. Hundreds of thousands of people from every corner of the globe would abandon their lives, sell everything they owned, and rush westward with a single obsessive dream: to strike it rich. They called themselves the 49ers. And the world they created in the California wilderness was unlike anything that had existed before. This is the story of the gold rush. Not the romanticized version from Hollywood westerns, but the real one. A story of desperate gamblers, back-breaking labor, instant cities rising from mud, and the brutal reality that for every man who found fortune, 1,000 found only death, disease, and crushing disappointment. This was the birth of the American West, and it was built on a lie. Before we understand the chaos that followed, we must first understand the California that existed before gold was discovered. In early 1848, California was a quiet, sparsely populated frontier at the very edge of the known world. It had just been ceded to the United States from Mexico after the Mexican-American War. But the ink on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was barely dry. The total non-indigenous population of California was perhaps 15,000 people, scattered across missions, ranches, and a few small settlements. San Francisco, which was then called Yerba Buena, was a sleepy village of about 200 souls. The landscape was spectacular but harsh. Rolling golden hills, towering redwood forests, and the distant snow-capped Sierra Nevada mountains. The indigenous peoples who had lived there for millennia were being displaced by Spanish missions and American settlers, but the region remained largely untouched wilderness. It was isolated from the rest of America by 2,000 miles of desert, mountains, and hostile territory. There were no railroads, no telegraph lines. News from California took months to reach the East Coast by ship around Cape Horn or overland by wagon. When James Marshall made his discovery at Sutter's Mill, he and his employer, John Sutter, a Swiss immigrant who owned vast tracts of land, tried desperately to keep it secret. They knew instinctively that if word got out, it would destroy the quiet agricultural empire Sutter was building. But secrets like this cannot be kept. Workers at the mill began disappearing, heading to the riverbanks with pans. Whispers spread to nearby settlements. By May 1848, San Francisco was emptying out. Merchants abandoned their stores. Sailors deserted their ships in the harbor. Everyone was heading to the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, to the place they were calling the Gold Fields. The first wave of prospectors were Californians and Mexicans, people already living in the region. They had a head start. Some of these early arrivals made fortunes almost effortlessly. Gold was so abundant in the streams that a man could collect hundreds of dollars worth in a single day just by scooping gravel into a pan and washing it in the river. These were the lucky ones. They arrived before the world knew what was happening. But that window was closing fast. The news spread slowly at first, carried by ships sailing from San Francisco to Hawaii, to South America, to China. By late 1848, newspapers on the East Coast began publishing rumors of gold discoveries in California, but many dismissed them as exaggerations or hoaxes. Then, in December 1848, President James Polk confirmed the reports in a message to Congress. He displayed actual gold samples brought back from California. The word was official, and that's when the floodgates opened. The year 1849 became the year of the gold seeker. Men from every state in the Union, from every social class, made the same calculation. A laborer in New York might earn $1 a day. Newspapers claimed that in California, a man could make that in minutes. Farmers abandoned their fields mid-season. Husbands kissed their wives and children goodbye, promising to return rich. Shopkeepers sold their businesses. Young men saw it as the adventure of a lifetime. Older men saw it as a final chance at wealth before death. They all had the same wild look in their eyes. Gold fever. It was a kind of madness. But getting to California in 1849 was an ordeal that tested every ounce of human endurance. There were 3 main routes, and each was brutal. The sea route around Cape Horn was the longest. Sailing from New York or Boston, ships had to travel 17,000 miles around the southern tip of South America, a journey that took 5 to 8 months through some of the most violent seas on Earth. Ships were overcrowded, food rotted, diseases like scurvy and dysentery killed passengers. The storms off Cape Horn were legendary. Massive waves, freezing rain, winds that snapped masts. Some ships sank. Others were blown so far off course they ran out of supplies and drifted for weeks. Passengers who survived arrived in San Francisco gaunt, sick, and traumatized. But they had made it. The second route was faster but more dangerous. It was called the Panama Shortcut. Travelers would sail from the East Coast to the Isthmus of Panama, cross the jungle on foot or by mule, through 50 miles of swamps, venomous snakes, and malarial mosquitoes, then board another ship on the Pacific side to sail north to California. Thousands died of tropical diseases in Panama. The crossing was a nightmare. Dense jungle, unbearable heat, contaminated water. Those who survived the jungle often found themselves stranded on the Pacific coast, waiting weeks or months for a ship with space. Desperate men paid fortunes for passage. Some died waiting. The third route was overland by wagon across the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains. This was the cheapest option, but perhaps the deadliest. Families sold everything to buy a wagon and supplies. They joined wagon trains in jumping-off towns like Independence, Missouri in the spring. They hoped to cross the 2,000 miles of wilderness before winter snows blocked the mountain passes. The journey took 4 to 6 months. The trail was littered with graves. Cholera swept through wagon trains, killing dozens in days. Accidents were common. Wagons overturned crossing rivers, drowning entire families. Oxen died of exhaustion, stranding travelers in the desert. The Donner Party disaster of 1846 was a recent memory. People knew the stakes, yet still they came in their tens of thousands. By the end of 1849, nearly 90,000 people had arrived in California. San Francisco transformed overnight from a sleepy village into a chaotic boom town. Ships from around the world crowded the harbor. But there was a problem. The sailors, the moment the ships docked, abandoned them and ran to the gold fields. Hundreds of ships sat rotting in the harbor, empty and silent. Some were dragged ashore and converted into hotels, stores, and saloons. The city grew so fast that there was no time for planning. Buildings were thrown up in days. Canvas tents stretched next to wooden shacks next to the occasional brick building. Streets were rivers of mud in winter, clouds of dust in summer. There were no sewers, no clean water. Cholera and dysentery were constant threats. The real story of the gold rush, though, was not happening in San Francisco. It was happening in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, in places with names that would become legend. Placerville, which was originally called Hangtown after vigilantes lynched several men from an oak tree. Sonora, Nevada City, Rough and Ready, a mining camp that briefly declared itself an independent republic. These were not towns in any traditional sense. They were anarchic, violent, improvised communities that appeared almost overnight and could vanish just as quickly. A typical mining camp began as a rumor. Someone finds gold in a creek. Within days, hundreds of men arrive. Tents go up. A makeshift saloon opens, selling whiskey at outrageous prices. A general store appears, charging $5 for a single egg. The camp has no law, no government, only rough agreements among miners. Everyone is armed. Most are young men in their 20s, far from home, with no families to temper their behavior. The atmosphere is tense, competitive, and often violent. Fights break out over claim boundaries. Theft is common. Justice, when it is administered, is swift and brutal. Vigilante mobs hang suspected thieves without trial. There are no jails, no courts. The code is simple: defend your claim or lose it. The work itself was nothing like the prospectors imagined. The reality of gold mining was not glamorous. It was backbreaking, soul-crushing labor. The simplest method was panning. A miner would scoop gravel from a riverbed into a shallow pan, add water, and swirl it carefully. Gold, being heavier than rock, would settle to the bottom. But this process was slow and yielded only tiny flakes. To make real money, miners had to move massive amounts of gravel. They stood knee-deep in freezing mountain streams for 10 to 12 hours a day, bending over, scooping, swirling. Their backs ached. Their hands cracked and bled from the cold water. Many developed chronic pain and arthritis. As the easy surface gold disappeared, miners had to dig. They used picks and shovels to carve into hillsides, following veins of gold-bearing quartz. They built sluices, long wooden troughs where water would wash gravel, catching gold in ridges along the bottom. Later, large mining companies introduced hydraulic mining, using high-pressure water cannons to blast entire hillsides apart, washing the debris through enormous sluices. This was devastatingly effective, but environmentally catastrophic. Whole mountains were eroded away. Rivers turned brown with sediment. Fish populations collapsed. The landscape was scarred in ways that are still visible today. The promise was that any man could strike it rich. The reality was that most miners barely scraped by. A successful day might yield $10 to $20 worth of gold. But everything in the mining camps was absurdly expensive. Flour cost $50 a barrel. A pound of coffee cost $5. A pair of boots cost $40. Eggs, butter, fresh vegetables were luxuries. Scurvy was rampant. Men survived on beans, bacon, and hardtack. The merchants, the people selling supplies, made far more money than the miners ever did. That was the real secret of the gold rush. The ones who got rich were not the men with pickaxes, but the men with shops. One of the most famous examples is Levi Strauss, a German immigrant who arrived in San Francisco in 1853 and began selling durable canvas pants reinforced with metal rivets to miners. They became known as blue jeans. He made a fortune. Sam Brannan, a Mormon entrepreneur, was one of the first to capitalize on the rush. He bought up every shovel, pan, and pickaxe he could find in San Francisco, then rode through the gold fields shouting about gold discoveries, whipping up frenzy. He then sold his supplies at massive markups. He became California's first millionaire without ever touching a pan. For every success story, there were 1,000 tragedies. Men who spent their life savings to reach California worked themselves to exhaustion for months and found nothing. They couldn't afford passage home. They were trapped, broke, and broken. Some committed suicide. Others turned to crime. Banditry was common on the remote roads connecting the camps. Stagecoaches carrying gold were frequent targets. Notorious outlaws like Joaquin Murrieta, a Mexican bandit whose legend grew to mythical proportions, terrorized the gold country. The social fabric of the mining camps was complex and brutal. The majority of miners were white Americans, but the gold rush attracted people from every corner of the world. Chinese immigrants arrived in large numbers, fleeing poverty and war in southern China. They worked claims that white miners had abandoned as worthless, and through patience and hard work, they often extracted gold others had missed. But they faced horrific racism. They were taxed unfairly under the foreign miners' tax. They were beaten, robbed, and sometimes murdered with impunity. Entire Chinese mining camps were burned to the ground by white mobs. Mexican and South American miners, called Sonorans, were among the most skilled. They brought centuries of mining knowledge from silver mines in Mexico. But after the Mexican-American War, white Americans viewed them with suspicion and resentment. They too faced violence and legal discrimination. Native Californians, the indigenous peoples, suffered the worst. The gold rush brought catastrophe to their communities. Miners invaded their lands, hunted their game, polluted their rivers. Vigilante groups and state militias hunted indigenous people, slaughtering entire villages. The indigenous population of California collapsed from perhaps 150,000 before the gold rush to fewer than 30,000 by 1870. It was a genocide, deliberate and systematic. Women were rare in the early gold fields, but those who came found unique opportunities. A woman who could cook, sew, or wash laundry could charge exorbitant prices. Some women ran boarding houses or restaurants and became wealthy. Others worked as prostitutes in the saloons and brothels that sprang up in every camp. The mining towns were overwhelmingly male, lonely, and desperate for female companionship. Some women made fortunes selling companionship and entertainment, but the life was hard and dangerous. Violence against women was common, and there was little legal protection. As 1850 turned to 1851, the character of the gold rush began to change. The easy gold was gone. What remained required industrial equipment, capital investment, and organized labor. Individual prospectors were being pushed out by mining companies. The era of the lone miner with a pan was over. The corporations moved in with hydraulic cannons, stamping mills, and deep shaft mines. They hired Chinese laborers at low wages to do the dangerous work. The romance was dying. But the gold rush had already transformed California. In 1850, California was admitted to the Union as the 31st state, skipping the usual territorial phase entirely because of its exploding population. San Francisco became a major American city almost overnight. The infrastructure that would define the West, the roads, the ports, the banking systems, all emerged from the gold economy. The culture of the West, the rugged individualism, the sense of lawlessness and opportunity, was forged in these mining camps. The environmental cost was staggering. Hydraulic mining destroyed river ecosystems. Mercury, used to separate gold from ore, poisoned waterways. Forests were clear-cut to build mining camps and fuel steam engines. The California landscape was forever altered. The social cost was equally profound. The gold rush accelerated the displacement and destruction of Native American communities. It embedded racial hierarchies and violence into the fabric of Western society. And it created a myth, the myth of the self-made man. The idea that anyone could strike it rich through hard work and luck. But the myth ignored the reality. Most failed, most suffered, and the real winners were those who exploited the dreamers. By the mid-1850s, the frenzy was fading. The boom towns that had sprung up so quickly began to empty out. When the gold ran dry, there was no reason to stay. Entire camps were abandoned. Buildings were left to rot. Main streets became overgrown with weeds. These became the ghost towns, the eerie remnants of a moment of collective madness. You can still find them today, scattered across the Sierra Nevada foothills. Faded wooden buildings, rusted equipment, a cemetery on a hill. They are monuments to hope and failure. The California Gold Rush was more than just a hunt for precious metal. It was a test of human ambition and endurance. It revealed both the best and worst of what people are capable of. The courage to leave everything behind and journey into the unknown. The creativity to survive in brutal conditions, but also the greed, the violence, the willingness to destroy others, and the land itself in pursuit of wealth. It was the real Wild West. Not the sanitized version from movies, but the chaotic, dangerous, and morally ambiguous reality. The legacy of 1849 is still with us. The cities that were born, San Francisco, Sacramento, and Stockton, are now among the largest in America. The infrastructure built to support the gold rush became the foundation for California's future growth. The culture of risk-taking and innovation that defined the 49ers is echoed today in Silicon Valley, where a new generation chases digital gold with the same desperate optimism. The promise is the same. Come west. Reinvent yourself. Strike it rich. And for every success story, there are thousands who fail quietly, their dreams buried like the miners who never made it home. The gold rush was a moment when the future felt wide open, when the rules seemed suspended, and anything felt possible. But the reality was harsher than the dream. The glittering flakes in the river were real, but so was the mud, the disease, the violence, and the heartbreak. The ghost towns stand as reminders. Not every rush ends in fortune. Most end in dust. Anyways, I'm Tim, watching the past so we can understand the present. And together we keep history reborn. I'll see you in the next era.